Amen. If you have your Bible, open with me to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 25, all right? 1 Samuel 25. Again, I am glad you are here. I know how hard it really is on these days after we lose our hour of sleep, but it always intrigues me. I would assume if we get less on the day after we lose sleep, wouldn't you think we would get more on the day after we gain an hour of sleep? I mean, but we don't. And so anyway, change kind of occurs. But I am glad. And if you do go to fall asleep, I will call your name if I know it. And if I don't know it, I'll just say, hey, you. And but anyway, I'm just glad you're here. 1 Samuel 24 brings us to a subject that I would suspect all of us have had to deal with at one time or another. I bound it up in 4 words. It's the subject of revenge, the subject of grudges, the subject of payback, the subject of getting even. Here we're going to find that David lived with an opportunity to make something of the grudge that he could have been carrying against Saul. Now, I need to... Every time I say the word grudge in my mind, a little story comes to mind, and so I'm going to tell it to you. Some of you have heard it, but it seems like there was this, you can only tell jokes on rednecks and lawyers now. So anyway, it seemed like there was this redneck farmer who went to a lawyer because he wanted to get a divorce. So he said to the lawyer, I wanted to get a divorce, and the lawyer said, well, let me ask you a question. Do you have any grounds? He said, yeah, sure, I got 40 acres. He said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. He said, do you think you have a case? He said, I don't have no case. I drive a John Deere. No. Do you have a grudge? Sure, I got a grudge. That's where I parked my John Deere. No. Do you have a suit? So I wear a suit every Sunday to church. Okay, we're not getting anywhere. Does your wife beat you up? We get up every morning at 4:30. He said, I don't understand. What's the problem? She says I can't communicate. So I love that. You got a grudge? That's where I'll park my John Deere. I don't know. I've lived with people who would answer it that way because they don't understand the King's English. But anyway, so we're going to talk about grudges, all right? You come to 1 Samuel 24, and again, we've been in the life of David. We've been in Samuel. We've been in the book of Psalms a number of times now. And the one thing that has typified David's life to this point is the pursuit of King Saul. I mean, Saul just can't seem to get over himself, and he constantly is after young David. You remember at the end of chapter 23, there was a little bit of somewhat of an enigmatic statement, if you will, but it was God's hand at work in David's life, because what it said at the end, jump in at verse 27 of chapter 23, but a messenger came unto Saul saying, hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid on the land. So Saul returned from pursuing David and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore they are called the place, the rock of escape. And then it says, David went up from there and stayed in the strongholds of En-Gedi. In the Hebrew text, chapter 23, verse 29 is chapter 24, verse 1. And so it gets a little confusing at times if you're trying to look through it. And because really that last verse in chapter 23 really sets up the whole account of chapter 24. David once again flees for his life, and now he flees to a place down near the Dead Sea, a place called En-Gedi. A place that was barren and deserty, but a place that had all of these natural springs and had these wonderfully cool caves that you could get in out of the heat. I think I said it a couple of weeks ago, but when we were in Israel those last 2 times, we've been there kind of at a warm time. And the last time it was in June. And I'm telling you right now, we could have longed for one of those caves. We didn't get to walk back to it, but we got to see it. And I kept standing there sweating, sweat dripping off of every part of my body actually, and not just my brow. But anyway, and we stood there and I thought, how how wonderful it must have felt for David and his 400, 600 men to get in out of the heat and to get into this cave knowing they were being pursued. Well, begin with me at chapter 24 and verse 1, and it said, "And then Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines. He was told, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. And then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats." Where in the world is that? The writer of the book knows. None of us know. We don't have any, we just can't really, there's a lot of these places that you really can't put your finger on, but it was down in that same area. And he came to the sheepfolds on the way. Notice that, because it's possible that once again David might have been somewhat familiar with these caves and places, because he may have taken his sheep there. It was a long way from Bethlehem, but there is the outside chance that he had been there. But notice he came to the sheepfolds on the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself, and David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. The first thing that we're going to talk about is actions that bother our conscience. See, our consciences are part of what God has put in us that they are a warning system to us that we're doing something wrong, or there is something that we need to make right. And there are things that are going to trip our conscience. You know, sometimes our consciences are tripped by things that we say are not right, which may or may not be right or wrong. I mean, we all have our own standards of living, and we have taken biblical principle and we have made out of them convictions for our lives. There are certain things in my life that I don't do I don't do them because they're sinful or wrong. I just have chosen not to do them. And if I were to do them, I'll guarantee you I would feel guilty. My conscience would be tripped. I've told you just just jokingly that since 1972, these 2 feet of mine have never walked into a movie theater. I walked out in 1972 and I declared to the Lord I would never walk into a movie theater again. And I haven't. If you drug me into one, I can tell you I would feel guilty. Should I feel guilty? Yes. No, I'm just kidding. But so should you. But anyway, my point is that I would feel guilty because that was my conviction. I said I wouldn't do that. And so if I ever broke that, I'd have to somehow, well, that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about biblical principles that if I break them, God will speak to my conscience, as it were, and my conscience will be tripped, and it's a warning signal that, hey, something is wrong. David was inside this cave. I put down for myself a number of questions like this. Why did Saul choose this cave? There were lots of caves in the area of En-gedi. He could have gone into any number of caves. Why did he choose that one? I jotted down for myself, not only that, why didn't he hear these men whispering? I mean, inside of a cave, there's generally an echo. So if there are 601 men in that cave that were with David, 600 of his men and one being David, if there were 600 men, can you imagine 600 men being quiet? Have you ever heard a man whisper? Men don't really whisper very well. A lot of times a man's whisper is pretty loud. It's always funny, isn't it? Like in church, people think they can whisper and get away with it. Hey, where are we going for lunch? It's kind of like, well, can you imagine in this cave, in walks Saul, and the men, notice it in verse 4, the men of David said, Behold, this is the day which the Lord has said to you, Behold, I'm about to give your enemy into your hand, and you'll do to him as it seems good to you. I don't think it was said just once. I sort of suspect that there was this little going on. My question is, why didn't King Saul hear all that noise? And I have a third question. Why did King Saul feel so comfortable that he went in alone, knowing that it was possible that in one of these caves, David and his 600 men were hiding? I mean, he could have assumed that this might be David's hideout. I better not go in alone. Now again, we won't necessarily talk about what Saul was doing in the cave. Most people would suggest that he went in to take a nap. I sort of think that when it says he went in to relieve himself, that's what he went in to do. If that's true, and I think it is, Saul probably wanted privacy, so that may be why he left all of his troops, 3,000 men, outside of the cave. But nevertheless, he's in there all alone. And the men of David see what has happened, and they say to him, I'm going to kind of summarize verse 4. David, this is your open door. God has provided you the opportunity. Saul is all alone. He has nobody to protect him. You have Goliath's sword in your hand. If I were you, I would just go whack off his head, and you'll be done with this enemy of yours. God has provided the way. Don't you love it when people tell you what God's will is when it's really not God's will? You know, we love to read circumstances like we read tea leaves. We think sometimes that an open door is an open door when it's really not an open door. Even though Saul was there all alone right in front of David, it wasn't the time for God that God was giving to David to kill his enemy. So David said, I can't do that. So he just arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Again, whether Saul had taken his robe off and hung it on the side or just exactly what the circumstances are is not necessarily important, except I think this. David would have had to have gotten awfully close to Saul to cut off part of his robe. We can ask the same question, why didn't Saul hear it? I think the answer to all of my questions is God was directing all of the steps. Why did Saul pick that cave and not that one or that one or that one? Because God led him in there. Why didn't he hear all the whisper and all the talk that was going on and surely all the movement? Because God kept his ears from hearing it. Why didn't he hear David sneaking up behind him? I mean, again, we're in a cave. Any kind of movement would have surely been a little bit louder in that cave because God kept Saul from hearing. So David cut off the edge of his robe secretly. And verse 5 is the key to everything that we're going to talk about for the rest of the time we have to be together, which, by the way, is an hour and a half because it's just 10:30. Boy, I heard some groans. Don't ever groan again, or I will go to... No, look at verse 5. And it came about afterwards that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of the robe. We do things that bother our conscience. We do things, we say things, we go places, and you and I know there was something wrong. God pricks our conscience. And we begin to reflect and recognize that wasn't right. If he had cut off Saul's head, he could have said, well, that's what my friends said to do. My friends said it was God's will. And by the way, just in case, in verse 4, where it said, behold, this is the day of which the Lord has said to you, I didn't find that in any other place, in Samuel or otherwise, that God was going to deliver his enemy into his hand. So whether or not these friends made that up, or whether or not, it just sounded good at the time, or whether God maybe had said that and it was never recorded, I don't know, but his conscience bothered him. He was moved by what he did. He knew that what he did was wrong. I mean, let's face it, I think we're on the right track to say this. Though David cut off the corner of his robe, what he really wanted to do was cut off his head. I mean, I know where we're going to head, but that's part of what comes out of verse 5. But even to do what he did demonstrated there was something in his heart that had not yet been dealt with. Come with me, if you would, to 1 John. Come over to the New Testament, to the book of 1 John. There's a little verse that you probably will remember when we get there. 1 John in chapter 3. I know that you all know what. I'll ask this question, class. What is maybe an operative word to sum up the book of 1 John? What would you tell me? Love. Love. And again, it's all through this book, as John writes, as the elder statesman of the church, the only surviving apostle by the end of the first century. And he writes, and again, just jump right into the context at verse 15, chapter 3 and verse 15. He said, everyone who hates his brother is a what? Murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. If David harbored any kind of hatred in his heart for King Saul, for all the times that he tried to impale him against the wall, or when he came pursuing him and desiring to kill him, if he harbored any hatred in his heart, he was already a murderer. You came to church today because by your action of coming to church, you're saying, I want to come and worship God. If there's anyone sitting here, or maybe not sitting here, who you harbor any kind of hatred against, you're no better than Charles Manson. You're a murderer. If your heart has no love for people, you're a murderer. And I think David in that cave, as he walked back to his men, again, I realize I'm trying to read between the lines, but if David was willing to go cut off this corner of his robe, I kind of think he must have walked back and said, hey guys, look what I got. I got the corner. But then his conscience bothered him. I want you to come with me to a couple of other passages, if you would. Go to chapter 25. Go back to 1 Samuel. Go to chapter 25. Obviously, when we get to chapter 26, we're going to see yet again that David will spare Saul's life. Next chapter, chapter 25, we're going to look at that great Old Testament character that we all want to emulate, Nabal, the fool. Okay, we don't want to emulate him. We'd rather emulate Abigail, right? But look at chapter 25. You remember the story. We'll look at it next week and remind ourselves of it. But David wasn't really happy with Nabal's response, and so he was going to do something about it. And you jump down at verse 31, when Abigail came to talk to to David, she said in verse 31, "This will not cause grief for a troubled heart to my Lord, both by having shed blood without cause, or by my Lord having avenged himself. When the Lord deals well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant." The point was, she said, look, vengeance isn't sweet. You're going to live with that. If any of you have ever acted on the impulse of getting revenge, I dare say that if you're really honest with yourself, it wasn't as sweet as you thought it was going to be. It didn't bring the kinds of feelings that you thought it would, because you sometimes are led to believe that they did it to me, doggone it, I'm going to do it to them, and that's going to feel good. And you do it to them, and all of a sudden you realize, I didn't quite get the joy I thought I would out of it. Abigail says you better be careful, because vengeance doesn't bring you what you think it's going to bring you. Go all the way over to 2 Samuel, if you would, towards the later, certainly later in David's life. Look at 2 Samuel and chapter 24. 2 Samuel 24. Jump down at verse 10, and it just simply says again, the same phrase, just translated a little differently. Now David's heart troubled him after he had numbered the people. Same idea. His conscience bothered him. Same way that he says it in chapter 24 of our 1 Samuel. The question I need to ask you this morning is your conscience bothered? Does God convict you of things that you've done and said and need to be changed, and you just put it off? You just go, well, I'll wait. If you wait too long, you'll have what the New Testament calls a seared conscience. I mean, I look at people and I look at their actions, I don't mean just here like us as a church, but I look at the way people respond in the world, and there are just times that I just go, how could they do that? How could they respond like that? Well, they have a seared conscience. They've allowed themselves to think that wrong actions and vengeance is the way to go. And like I say, they come to realize it's not sweet, it's bitter. But sometimes people can sit under the gospel preaching. They can hear the gospel in one day and another day and one Sunday and another Sunday and 1 month and another month. Some people can hear the gospel all their life and never come to Christ. Why? I think because many of them have a seared conscience. They've convinced themselves that there really is no eternity. It's water off a duck's back. David wasn't like that. See, I think if you were to continue to, and we've been doing a little bit, but I think again, if you compare and contrast, why was David the non-perfect man that he was? And we're going to see some of his sins throughout his experience that we're going to be looking at his life. I mean, he was sinful, Saul was sinful. What was the difference? The difference was Saul never had a conscience that was bothered. It didn't bother him that he didn't kill the king of the Amalekites. Didn't bother him that he continued to pursue the anointed one. Didn't bother him to kill all those priests. His conscience was never bothered. David's was. David recognized when he sinned. Even as we'll see months ahead from now, but that infamous story of David and Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. When David was finally confronted, his conscience bothered him. If you don't have a bothered conscience, if you can sin and just not even, and never thinks a second about it, if you can just hate your brother, if you can just live a life that is not honoring to God, if your conscience is seared, you're in deep trouble. I think if you can read God's Word and never be convicted, never say, oh God, that's something I need to change. I mean, it's not doing you any good. So how do we clear our conscience? Well, let me make sure I make a distinction. There is a difference between clearing our conscience and soothing our conscience. We have all kinds of ways in our culture to soothe our conscience. Generally, it kind of goes like this. Wasn't my fault. Wasn't me. If they had just not said, if they had just road rage. I think I've told this story before, but I'll never forget. This has been quite a few years ago now. I was coming home from Martinez from a pastor's lunch, and I'm coming down 680, just not far out of Martinez, and I saw a car come in and just go whoo, just pull right in front of this guy. I mean, you know, and the guy that got cut off didn't like it too well. About 2.5 seconds later, he yanked it out into traffic, slammed on his accelerator, got ahead of the guy, got over in front of him, jammed on his brakes. And all of a sudden, the guy behind thought, okay, good for you. He jammed on his accelerator, went out through traffic, got ahead of the guy, and literally tried running him into the barrier. I mean, I'm sitting here watching this going, we're going to all die. We're going to all die. Because this thing's going to have a wreck. It's not like the highway was empty. And this went on for, I don't know, finally the one guy decided, I guess he'd had about enough, and he just sped away. But I just thought, because you got cut off, you were willing to kill? If that guy had lost traction and gone, who knows what could have happened? Yeah, well, how do we... See, I guess what I was going to say is, that guy could soothe his conscience. He could say, well, he cut me off. It was his fault. It wasn't my fault. See, you could sit here and say, well, Pastor, I know that I don't really have a lot of love for that guy over there, that lady over there. You know, I actually hate them. You're right. But do you understand what they did to me? Do you understand what she said to me? No, I may not. But you're not excused. What's done to us isn't an excuse for sin. So I'm not talking about how do we soothe our conscience. How do I make myself feel better? I'm talking about how do I clear it. I read a quote, and I loved this quote. I think I jotted it down for myself. Yeah, I love this quote. One author said this: there is no softer pillow than a clear conscience. I like that. There is no softer pillow than a clear conscience. So, how do we clear our conscience? How do we make things right? Well, let me take you to a verse, Romans in chapter 12. As you turn to Romans in chapter 12, if you're a note taker, I could have you jot down a number of verses that we won't have time to turn to. Proverbs chapter 15:1 says, a soft answer turns away wrath. Wow, if we could just all practice that, huh? Get in the midst of a disagreement, and things start being said, and the volume level begins to rise, and the heat level begins to rise, and you say things that you don't really mean per se, but they get said. If one of you can just stop for a minute, and a soft answer turns away wrath. There are times when you just need to back up, and you need to respond in a whole different way than what your insides are telling you. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 32 just again talks about being slow to anger. James chapter 1, slow to wrath, quick to hear. Sometimes we do it just the opposite, do we not? We're quick to wrath and slow to hear. We only hear what we want to hear, and then we interpret it, and then we respond in our anger and our wrath. That's just the opposite way to clear your conscience. In Romans chapter 12, there are some very practical words. Practical, not easy. Clear, not easy. Look at verse 17. How do I clear my conscience? How do we go from a bothered conscience of something I did wrong, or maybe something that was done wrong to me, like Saul trying to kill David. How do I get it right? Well, verse 17, Romans 12 says, never pay back evil for evil to anyone. When we were kids growing up, we learned the golden rule. Right? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. It's been changed, has it not? Do unto others like they have done unto you. If they hurt you, hurt them back. If they say evil things about you, say evil things about them. If they slander you, slander them. It's the way the world reacts. But that's not the way we are supposed to act. I mean, I don't know about you. I could have lived with that verse not being there. Never. Even if he had said, okay, most times don't pay back evil for evil. I could have lived with that. I don't like that never thing. Because, man, there have been times, look, James chapter 3 says, don't ever want to become a teacher because you're held to a higher standard because you talk a lot. That's kind of my own little translation there, okay? My paraphrase. And I seem to talk a lot, and I know there are times that I have paid back evil for evil. I've had to make things right. I know that there are times that I've said things. By the way, even if I say it in prayer meeting, oh, please pray for Sam. You can't imagine what an idiot he is. We need to pray for him. Okay, that's paying back evil for evil, okay? I mean, that's not really a prayer request. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. We'll come back to verse 18 as we wrap this thing up, hopefully, and if possible, so far as depends upon you, be at peace with all men. Now, verse 19, don't you just hate 100% words? Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Never take revenge. Revenge! Don't misunderstand now. This isn't saying somebody doesn't have to live with consequences of actions. It says don't take revenge. Don't avenge the evil that's been done to you. Don't avenge the wrong that's been done to you. Don't take your piece of flesh. Why? God can do it better than you can. God will do it. That thing in verse 19, give room for God's wrath. You clear your conscience by saying, God, I understand that this person has wronged me, said evil things about me. For David, he could say, God, this guy wants to kill me. And the Lord says, give me time, David. In God's time. Ugh. What a terrible four-letter word. Wait. We do not like that. I don't like that. Maybe you do. Maybe you're a waiter. I am not a waiter. Like, even to wait on tables. I am not that. I like to do things now. See, that was part of what David's men said. David, instant gratification. Justifiable homicide. Get him, David, right now. And David kind of did by taking the corner of his robe, and then his conscience bothered him, and he had to say, wait a minute. In God's time, Saul will be dead, and I'll be on the throne. Ugh. Never take revenge. You know what? Wouldn't it have been nice if he had just ended the chapter there? I mean, look at verse 20. I mean, are you kidding me? If your enemy is hungry, shoot him. If he's thirsty, laugh at him. Oh no, sorry, it's not at all what it says. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you'll heap burning coals on his head. Now again, I have to tell you, I am glad for the latter part of the verse, because I think it's an interesting picture. That person who hates you, you're over there at the snack time, and you know there's a person that just doesn't like you. Take him a donut. Walk up to him and say, would you like a donut? Now do it with the right motive, okay? I'm kind of being a little facetious here. But if you do it with the right motive, you know what happens. You can just see it. Smoke starts to go, because they don't know what to do. They're like, why is this person being nice to me? It's like heaping coals of fire on their head, because they don't know how to respond. What do I do with that? Oh boy, look at verse 21. Don't be overcome with evil. Overcome evil with good. The words overcome there are military terms. None of those verses are easy, but they are a way to clear your conscience. Go back to 1 Samuel 24 quickly, because we don't have much time left, but just go back there, because you have to see David's words. I mean, look at verse 6. He said to his men, far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. David persuaded his men with these words and didn't follow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose and left the cave and went on his way. And afterward David arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, saying, my Lord the king. And Saul looked behind him. Oh my word. Can you imagine for just a moment what it must have felt in Saul's heart to hear the voice of David behind him, knowing he was in that cave alone with David, and he assumed, I'm sure, all of his army. Can you imagine the thoughts that went through his mind at that very moment? And his 3,000 men are still over there. Saul is still alone from what I'm picking up from the story. And David said, my Lord the king. And Saul looked, and David bowed with his face to the ground and prostrated him. And David said, why do you listen to the words of men, saying, behold, David seeks harm to you? Behold, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord had given you into my hand in the cave. And some said to kill you, but my eye had pity on you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Now, Father, see. Isn't it? Look at how he calls him. Now, Father, see. Why in the world would he call him Father? He was his son-in-law, you know. He may have been helping Saul to recognize there was a family relationship there. Oh, by the way, Saul, indeed, see the edge of your robe in my hand. Can you imagine? Think back to any shepherd story you ever saw in any Christmas thing with their bathrobes. And all of a sudden, think about old Saul going, what? He pulls up his robe and he goes, oh, that corner piece is gone. I hadn't recognized that when I put it back on. I didn't see that. He's holding my corner of the robe. Can you imagine what he was thinking? He had to think, this guy could have killed me. He was close enough to use a dagger, much less Goliath's sword. Verse 12, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge me on you by my hand, but my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancient says, out of the wicked comes forth wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? Now it's interesting, the two next words, you can have a question mark like our translation, or just David answers his questions, whichever, a dead dog or a flea. The Lord therefore judge and decide between you and me. May he see and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. When David had finished speaking these words, Saul said, "Is that your voice, my son David?" Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, Saul said to David, "You're more righteous than I am. You've dealt well with me while I have dealt wickedly with you. You've declared today that you have done good to me and that the Lord delivered me into your hand, and yet you did not kill me. If a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely?" The answer is no, not normally. May the Lord therefore reward you with good in return for what you have done to me this day. Now behold, I know that you'll surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. So now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's household. David swore to Saul. Listen, here, let me sum it up real quickly. Here's what David said. Listen, Saul, I was wrong. Will you forgive me? He didn't say to Saul, look, because you've been pursuing me, I did what I did, and so really it's your fault. No, David simply said, Saul, I don't know why you're believing the lies that people are telling you, but here's the thing. I was wrong to cut off your robe because you are God's anointed. Whether I like it or not, you're God's anointed. If I really wanted to get overly practical, I'd get a little bit political. I may or may not, it's up to me to decide, I may or may not like the guy that's in the White House, but I better respect his position. I may or may not agree with his policies, but I better respect his position. I don't think David thought what Saul was doing was right, but that wasn't the issue. If he wanted to clear it, David had to own up to his own sin and his own sinful reaction that I think was motivated from an attitude of hatred. He had allowed that to take over his heart for that moment. See, I think David was repenting more of his attitude than he was his action, because he knew that if he didn't make sure that his attitude was right, his actions would never be right. Some of us don't live with a very clear conscience because we're not about to admit that we're wrong. It is always someone else. Well, Saul went to his home and David went to his stronghold. David's so wise. David didn't say, well, everything must be all figured out with old King Saul. Let's just all go out and live happily ever after out in the middle of the field. David said, no, I think we better stay in the stronghold. Because I think David understood Saul's response wasn't really true. You can cry crocodile tears all you want, but if you don't change in your heart, you're no different. That's what Saul, he cried, oh, David, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Until the next opportunity in chapter 26 comes and he's going to go kill him again. Remember the old days? Some of you do, because you're old like me. Remember the old days when every Sunday was an altar call? I mean, every Sunday was an altar call. There'd be people that stream down that aisle and they'd come up front and they'd weep big crocodile tears. They'd walk out that door, never changed in their heart. Next time the altar call was given, down they'd come, down the front cry. Oh. Evangelists would come. They'd come down the aisle. Oh, I got to get my life right with God. Nothing would change. Folks, listen. If you harbor any kind of hatred, if you harbor any kind of bitterness, I've got to come back to this. I'm going to have to finish it before we go to chapter 25 and look at Nabal the fool. Because we need to talk a bit about bitterness. We need to talk about Hebrews 12, getting rid of the root of bitterness. Because some of you have allowed that root to grow pretty deep. That's why you want your piece of flesh. Oh, listen. You can take your piece of flesh if you want, but you're never going to be happy. Never be happy. You're going to live with it. David's response to me is so unbelievable. And so different than what most of us would do. Let's pray. Father, we end this study this morning, and I have no idea about the hearts that are here in front of me or those who may have been listening on our live stream. I don't have an x-ray vision into people's hearts. Only you do. And each person sitting here, if they're really honest, they know about what their heart is doing. And Lord, I pray so much that if there are any here bent on revenge, if there are any here who are living with the hurts from people and they're not willing to make it right, they're not willing to give place to your wrath, oh, how I pray that you will give them grace to do that. King Saul didn't really change his path, we know, but Heavenly Father, David did. May that be true of us. If there's anyone here this morning whose heart is either seared or on its way to being seared, I pray that your Holy Spirit would change that hardened heart. That they would respond in a way that would be honoring to you and life-changing. How I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Take your hymn books, please, and turn to number 382. 380.